I'm Massi. This is my first ever talk. Start crying, pretend it's not happening. So today we're going to talk about how native species are the cornerstone of a thriving, resilient landscape. So something we like to do when we start all of these talks is related back to the Sisters of St. Joseph land ethics statement. So that was something that was signed by all the sisters in the congregation in 2015. And that is stating that we are citizens of a larger community, and that includes plants, animals, insects, and the sisters were affirming their connection to God and their dear neighbor and nature. So, frankly, every line of the land ethics supports planting native plants, but we're going to talk about this one today. So, to preserve, protect, restore, and cherish the integrity, biodiversity, balance, and beauty of the land and all the species with whom we share. So for me, that means we need to stop taking from the land, we need to listen, and we need to react to what our planet wants and what it needs and what it's telling us. So let's start this by just thinking about a few questions throughout the presentation. So, what is a native plant? Do all plants do the same things for our ecosystem? And can one native plant make a difference? All right, so what is a native plant? So first of all, when we're talking about native plants, it has to be tied to a specific ecoregion. So there's no such thing as native plants as a generality. So if we're talking about right here, we might say Long Island native plant, New York native plant, North American, Northeastern native plant. So if you're going out and you're doing some research on native plants to plant in your yard, make sure that you're finding native plants to your specific ecoregion. With that, what is a native plant? It occurs naturally in a particular ecoregion. It has co-evolved with climate, soil, and other species. And it has existed within this ecoregion for thousands of years without human intervention. So that is to say, no one brought it over on a ship, no one planted it intentionally, it is just here and it's kind of been here for as long as it's been anywhere. So why are our native species so special? Because of the coevolution. So Long Island native plants are perfectly suited for our climate. So they have for thousands of years adapted to our periods of cold, our top temperatures, our average rainfall. It's what they sort of grew up having, what they've always known, and what they need. Same goes for soil types. So many of the plants that are native to Long Island are prairie species. They have really deep roots that go sometimes 15, 30 feet into the ground. So that helps them with our drought conditions and things like that. So roots of native plants actually have the morphology where they are adapted to the types of soil that they are supposed to be in, they're used to being in. So they might have roots that can easily go through a loamy soil, or root stock shapes that can go into clay soil, and that is something that is going to be specific to a native plant of that area. We mentioned drought conditions, those nice deep roots can get all the good stuff. And soil types. So imagine a plant has always been here, it's lived here forever. It has grown to want and need the exact nutrient mixes that are in our soil. So when you think about having a native plant, you might think, oh, they don't need much fertilizer, they don't need much water. And that is because our soil, our land, has exactly what they need. Obviously, if you're planting a new planting somewhere, you're going to have to water it in, native plant or not. But established plantings, unless there's some extreme condition, can survive and thrive with the kind of stuff we got going on right here. And something cool about North American species in particular is that we have fire-dependent and fire-tolerant species. So, as many of you know, we annually burn our meadows. And we're able to do that because we have these plants, these prairie plants, that have these really deep roots, 15, 30 feet to the ground. So When we set fire to the meadow, that burns all these shallow-rooted, these non-native plants, and that allows our plants then to just kind of pop up, hold the ground, and be doing what they want to. And I think that is pretty cool. When we're talking about coevolution, just as an example, I'm saying thousands of years, but fossil records show that oaks have been in North America for 45 million years. So I think we're friends. I think native plants are probably pretty good friends with the land here. What else about coevolution? So our plants have then co-evolved with insects. So 90% of insects are specialists, and that means they eat specific plants. They can't just eat any old plant, they have to eat specific plants. So this is a picture of the spicebush swallowtail. The spicebush swallowtail can only lay their eggs on plants that are in the laurel family. So if you don't have laurels, these spicebush swallowtails can't lay their eggs. And so when these host plants, when insects have a host plant, it's because their life cycles are synchronized with those plants. So at the time when the butterflies need nectar, those plants are providing that nectar. And so they've kind of grown together to be doing everything that each other needs at the same time. And the reason why most of these 90% of insects can't just eat anything is because of leaf toxicity. So they just can't stomach any old plant. And we actually had that as humans, and we have selectively bred our crops to be more palatable. We've made juicier watermelons. We've taken wild cabbage and made broccoli and kale and Brussels sprouts. Insects have not been able to do that. So anything that has existed that they were able to eat is all they can still eat. Generalists, so the other 10% of our species are generalists, and those have a detoxifying enzyme inside of them that allows them to eat other species. Maybe not everything, but they can browse a little more, and you're thinking, well, then do we even need those specific plants? Well, we'll get into a little bit later why you can't just have a landscape with just generalists. You need these specialist insects. And up to 90% of all insect herbivores can successfully reproduce only on plant lineages with which they have shared an evolutionary history. So that is to say that 90% of insects can only lay eggs on the native plants that they're evolved with. So we all know about monarchs, I think, at this point. Monarchs need milkweed to lay their eggs on as the eggs hatch. The caterpillars then enjoy the tender milkweed leaves. And they grow up and then they get nectar from the milkweed and from other plants. So almost all of our insect species have these same specifics. Monarchs just happen to have good PR. So every one of our species really need these specific plants to exist and to thrive and to travel from place to place. So Lepidoptera, the order that includes butterflies and moths, require both nectar sources and host plants, like you mentioned. So that means we need a diverse landscape. We can't just have the plants that are their host species. We need other things for them to eat and places for them to go to have a robust life. Now, oaks, which are kind of a superstar in native plants, can host over 500 species of Lepidoptera. So that means over 500 species of butterflies and moths lay their eggs on oaks. Now, that does not include beetles, leafhoppers, tree hoppers, wasps, and all these other insects that can feed off of the oaks or live within the oaks. That is just butterflies and moths. So when we're thinking about this oak, we're having multiple generations of these varied species within the oak. The oak is going to live for around 300 years. So the question is, does one plant make a difference? Well, multiple generations for every year, over 300 years, that's a lot of species. species. That's almost a whole ecosystem right inside of them. Just an important factoid to know if you are going forward and making the great choice to put native plants on your landscape is insects overwinter in leaves, they overwinter in hollow stems of flowers and grasses. So if you're making a native landscape, you should leave the leaves, don't deadhead your plants, because maybe you're feeding the insects, but you don't have a place for them to live. And removing native insects is directly correlated with the decrease in bird abundance. So you're thinking, well, actually, I don't even want insects in my yard. I don't really like insects. They don't need to be in my plants. I don't need to see them. Well, perhaps you like birds. 96% of North American birds feed insects to their young. Chickadees need 350 to 570 insects per day to feed their young. That is 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to feed one brood of their young, which is 2 to 5 chicks. So it kind of sounds like we might need some more native plants than we were thinking. Right now, there are 3 billion fewer birds in North America than 50 years ago. 430 species of birds in North America are at risk of extinction, and most bird populations are limited by the amount of food that they can find. So already we're seeing the loss of these birds because we're not providing this robust landscape for them to have lunch, breakfast, and dinner. So why do we need all these different species of plants, of insects, and birds? Well, because a healthy planet needs biodiversity. Biodiversity is the variety of all forms of life, species, ecosystem, and ecosystem adjacencies. So for Long Island, that means grasslands, pine barrens, coastal wetlands, and more. We need all those things, and we need them adjacent to each other and healthy to have biodiversity. So biodiversity is necessary for creation of services. We need it for us to be able to produce food, to have clean water, to have clean air, to stop floods and keep our soil nice and fertile, as well as for pharmaceutical possibilities. So I don't know if any of you know about the chemical compound Taxol. So Taxol is derived from the Pacific yew tree. That is a chemical compound that was found to kill cancer cells. That is actually used in chemotherapy now to kill cancer. Not just plants. There is a predatory cone snail in the Indo-Pacific region whose peptides from their venom is using, again, to treat cancer patients for pain. So all of these possibilities, all these scientific advancements that we don't even know are possible could be going away as we lose some of these species that we have yet to research or really spend time with. And that's a bummer. So, native plants, they're out there providing nectar for our birds and our bees and our bats and butterflies. They're providing shelter, there's seeds and nuts and fruits and everything for our wildlife. But diversity only matters if it is species from the ecoregion that is taking part in the ecosystem. So that is to say that non-native species, having a million different types of them, does not count towards biodiversity. To have biodiversity, you need things that feed into the ecosystem. So variety is needed for resistance, pollination, disease control, and for redundancy. So all species in general, but today we're talking about plants, there's genetic diversity within those species. So having this genetic diversity within a plant, some plants may be able to, within a species, may be able to withstand certain things that others can't, or better with drought or whatnot. So having all of these large groups of variety within the same species makes that species stronger. So if we're putting less and less of every species, we're losing the strength of the species itself. So right now humans are actually trying to recreate that type of genetic diversity to deal with the emerald ash borer. So the emerald ash borer is a boring beetle from Asia. It is a non-issue in Asia, but it has come to the United States, it's come to Europe, and it's wiping out ash trees and leaving no prisoners. So right now in Oregon, the emerald ash borer is knocking at their door, and they have gone out and gotten a bunch of different ashes from different provenances, different places and different slight ecoregions within the area, and they're planting them in these forests to see if any of them can hold up to the emerald ash borer and fight against the beetle and keep the species alive. So it works so good that we're trying to do it as science. And I want to talk about the river popper hypothesis. So that was written by Paul Ehrlich, an environmentalist, in 1986, where he is saying that every species should be considered as critical. So what the river popper theory is that the ecosystem of the planet is like a plane. We're riding along in that plane, and every time we get off the plane, we're taking away a rivet. Removing a rivet is removing a species. So the plane can fly pretty okay, maybe we're not noticing what's going on, with the loss of a few rivets, the loss of a few of these native species. But at some point, we're hitting the threshold where one more rivet, one more species is going to be a plane crash, it's going to be the collapse of the ecosystem. So I think that's something we should consider when we're making some of these decisions. So I'm not telling you to get rid of your non-natives. We all love some ornamental plants, and that's fine, but I think we all need to know that there are some risks with planting non-natives. So first of all, the big risk is for that species to become an invasive species. So an invasive species is a non-native organism that can quickly reproduce and spread, causing harm to the environment or the ecosystem or even humans. So invasive species come to a place where they are not from, they don't have natural predators, and they can spread, reproduce, and take over some of the places where we have these native plants. So it can take years or decades to know whether a species is invasive. And in many cases that's too late, to the point where they can outcompete some of our native species. So imagine you planted a beautiful ornamental in your front yard and you think, well, it's just my yard, that's no big deal, I can keep an eye on it. Well, a bird might come, they might eat the seeds from that, poop that seed right in the middle of a pristine woodland, and now the middle of your woodland is overtaken by an invasive species. And the point of this is that we can't know for sure that everything we're planting is safe, is not going to one day become invasive. So you know some invasive species, and some are worse than others, but you're actually seeing them everywhere. For example, English ivy, those triangular-shaped green leaves that are climbing up buildings and trees, and it's kind of pretty. Well, that's an invasive species. It's escaped captivity. It's filling up woodlands, and it's taking some of those places where our native species should be, can be, and that's not even a particularly bad one, although some people might argue against it. But some of them are way worse, and that one's pretty bad. So you're thinking, well, I'm buying all my ornamentals at a greenhouse, at a nursery. Well, 61% of nurseries in the United States sell non-natives on state invasive lists. So that means that they're selling things in states that maybe the next state has those plants on the no-sell list. There's no rule that's telling from state to state who can sell what. And a lot of that is because of growers lobbying. So some of these beautiful ornamentals have big money value, and they are paying lobbyists to get that plant not put onto a no-sell list so they can keep making money. And that money talks. So when we're buying something from a nursery, we can't be sure that it's really safe. And in some cases, just because, you know, the man is paying the dollars. Yeah. And additionally, because pest-free ornamentals are often favored for our yards, so that eliminates the generalists altogether. We had these 90% of specialists. Well, now we're not having any of those specific plants. We're just going to have the 10% of generalists. Well, now you're planting something that nobody wants. So now you've got even less species enjoying things, and you're taking away from that system even more. Now, hosts for invasive insects. This one I think is particularly poignant because it's been on the forefront of everyone's mind. So, the spotted lanternfly. The spotted lanternfly, whose primary host is the tree of heaven. Now, the tree of heaven was brought to the United States in 1784. It was available in nurseries by 1840. Now here we are, 200 years later. Tree of heaven is planted all over the place. It's really aggressive. It's very hard to kill. It needs herbicide. It needs constant attention and attacks. So now we have a landscape that's full of this invasive tree of heaven. In 2012, the spotted lanternfly came in on a shipment from overseas with an egg mass. And here are the spotted lanternflies with their host plant, their beloved tree of heaven, which looks like this, all over the place. So we've got exactly what they need, exactly what they're feeding on to help them thrive and live the best life. So every time we're planting these invasive species, or these potential invasive species, or these species that we didn't know anything about, we're potentially laying the groundwork for future invasive insects. Spotted lanternfly wasn't the first, and it will not be the last. What's next? Why? We're wasting energy resources by planting non-natives. We're severing the food web. So, when we're planting a native plant into the landscape, it is within the landscape. It is receiving water as nutrients. It is going into the soil. It's pulling nutrients from the soil. It is turning those nutrients into green leaves and big biomass that's eaten by insects, which are eaten by birds, and so on and so on. So the energy from our planet is being turned into energy for all of these guys, insects, birds, whatever, within the food web, and so on and so on and so on, transferring the energy. When we're planting a non-native or sometimes an invasive, we are completely severing that food web. It is taking the energy from the earth, and that energy is not going anywhere. So that is ecosystem inefficiency. I mentioned we were going to talk about why generalists are bad. So getting rid of these specialists, these insects that eat multiple different particular species, and just having generalists is called biotic homogenization. Now, when you started 100% of insect possibilities, now we're only planting ornamentals, so we just have these generalists. So that's only 10% of the insect population is now here. Now, imagine some sort of a virus comes. It wipes out a huge swath of these generalists. Well, now we're down to only 8% of this 100% of insects that we once had. So when we're making these choices, we're taking these huge risks that we can be putting ourselves in danger for some of these catastrophic events by not having these redundancies, these backups, these plan Bs, the second option for dinner when the first thing you want isn't there. So there's more risk. You have the bottleneck effect. So when you have a particular species and there's less and less of them around, well then sometimes some of those can get wiped out, and then they can have some bad qualities. They can be ugly. They can get certain diseases, and maybe that's all we have left. So when we're having less options, less of those species around, we're putting ourselves at risk for eliminating the strongest of the species, and in potentially eliminating that species within the future. So it is putting us at increased vulnerability to some of these large-scale environmental events. Now, how does that relate to us? Well, it does, because the continental U.S. has lost 150 million acres of habitat to urban sprawl. Lawns cover 40 million acres. 70% of forests on the eastern seaboard are gone, and only 3 to 5% of the United States are preservations. So if you're thinking, my yard doesn't really matter, we got all these parks around here that are going to house the native species, they're going to have all the plants, they're going to have all the insects. That's only 3 to 5% of the entire North America. So do you think our migratory birds are following a map, going from park to park to park? We need this habitat connectivity. We need to have places to help support our bioregions, to help support the ecosystem between those parks. We took these 150 million acres away. Maybe we didn't know better then, but we do know better now. And we have these spaces where we could be nourishing our ecosystem, nourishing our environment. And I think it's our job to choose to do that. So I'd like to tell you that one plant does matter. More plants also are great. Maybe plant more than one plant. But now is the time to do our part. So as your landscape ages, if you lose a tree in your yard, in the spring when you're planting some of your annuals, make a choice to put in some perennials. Shoot for 70% native plants if you can. Make these small changes, because everything you do is going to host a variety of insects and make us have a more robust, diverse ecosystem. We're out here, we recycle, we're conserving energy, we're turning off the lights, we're using reusable shopping bags, and this is just the next piece of the puzzle. So now that we know we can do better, we should do better, so I implore you to plant one plant, help us put back a rivet in the plane, so we can maybe not crash and burn. I don't know. It's looking bad there in general, but we can do what we can, right? So I want to leave this on a quote from Aldo Leopold, who seemed to know what was going on when he said this in 1949, and maybe we've strayed otherwise. But he said, "A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of a biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise." That's all I think.